With a fill-in-the-blank proof, there can be a real tendency to want to go ahead and jump into the first blank that you need to fill in. As a good practice, I recommend that you approach these proofs as you would approach constructing a proof from scratch, even though the process will be a little bit different. And by that, what I mean is start by taking stock. The first thing you should do is identify your conclusion. Next, make sure that you read through your premises. Try to get a feel for what the argument is telling you and start looking for patterns. For example, you might notice that premise 4 says that if B and R, then not S. And that we've got B and R. In other words, premises 2 and 3 together, when combined with premise 4, are going to allow us to derive not S. If you're already familiar with the rules a little, you'll recognize this as an application of conjunction and then of modus ponens. Even if you're not already familiar with the names of the rules, being able to identify how some of these pieces fit together is crucial to being able to construct not just a proof from scratch, but also to completing a fill-in-the-blank proof. Now, you may also notice that your conclusion is a disjunction. And it's not just any disjunction, but it's a disjunction where the right-hand disjunct seems to come out of thin air. That is to say, I doesn't show up anywhere in your premises. This is a clue that you might be using add to get your conclusion. If you were constructing the proof from scratch, these kinds of notes, and I do suggest that you actually make them notes instead of keeping it all in your head, help get you started and give you some guidance as the proof proceeds. Even for the fill-in-the-blank proof, you'll see that we make use of some of these insights. We're now ready to take a look at line 6 and see what justification allows us to derive B and R. The first thing to notice about line 6 is that it is a compound sentence and that the main connective is a conjunction. The next thing to notice is where elements of this sentence might show up in previous lines, or perhaps even the whole sentence itself. This is because in a proof, a subsequent line is always based on a prior line or a combination of prior lines. And so you will see bits and pieces of the new line, or maybe even the entire line, in a prior line. Here, for example, B occurs at line 2, and R occurs at line 3. In addition, the whole sentence B and R occurs at line 4. Now, how do we know which of these lines is used to derive line 6? This is where you need to know the rules. For starters, B and R occurs in premise 4 as the antecedent. We do not have a rule that allows us to derive the antecedent. And so we know that line 4 is not going to be useful for us here. In contrast, there is a rule that allows us to derive a conjunction given the conjuncts on separate lines. The rule conj, short for conjunction, says given two sentences on lines by themselves, you can derive or get the conjunction of those two lines. And of course, that's exactly the pattern that we have going on here. And so we know that line 6 is justified with conj on lines 2 and 3. Line 7, it's a negation. And notice that the entire sentence occurs on line 4. And more importantly, it occurs as the consequent of a conditional. This tells us that we're very likely going to be able to use modus ponens, or rule MP, to get line 7. Rule MP says, given a conditional on a line by itself, the matching antecedent on another line, then you get the consequent. And so if we are going to use modus ponens here, the sentence that we have to look for is the matching antecedent. our antecedent is B and R. We look for where we've got that, which is line 6. And so then line 7 is justified using modus ponens on 4 and 6. Line 8. It's a negation. And this time when we try to find where this sentence might have come from, we find that its component sentence appears in line 1, and the whole sentence appears in line 5. How do we know which line or combination of lines will we be deriving line 8 from? Well, again, we go back to our rules. Here, not H is occurring as the antecedent of a conditional. And when we think about our rules, there's no rule that allows us to derive or break off the antecedent of a conditional. So chances are we aren't going to be using line 5. Well, what about line 1? What's a rule that might allow us to derive the negation of this antecedent? Well, that would be rule modus tollens, or MT. Given a conditional and the negation of its matching consequent, we're allowed to derive the negation of its matching antecedent. So then what we're looking for in a line by itself is the negation of the matching consequent. That means we're looking for tilde s to appear somewhere in our proof, and it does. That means that line 8 is derived using MT on lines 1 and 7. Line 9, we're trying to derive Z. When we look for where Z may have come from, we've really only got one choice. Z occurs in premise 5 as the consequent, and there's our clue that we're going to be using modus ponens. Modus ponens is the rule that allows us to derive the consequent of a conditional given a conditional and its matching antecedent. So what we need to look for is the matching antecedent on a line by itself. That means we're looking for not H on a line by itself. That occurs on line 8. And so line 9 is justified using modus ponens on lines 5 and 8. And finally, we're at line 10. On the one hand, because we made this observation earlier, we know how to complete line 10. It's going to be add on line 9. But let's say we hadn't noticed this earlier. Our process would be the same as it was before. We're looking to derive Z wedge I. We want to fix our attention on the fact that this is a disjunction. We want to look for where elements of the sentence occur in previous lines. And notice that Z or I does not occur in any previous line. The conclusion stated here is just a statement of your goal. This sentence, because it occurs after that forward slash, after the therefore, this sentence Z or I has not been entered into the proof yet. So that means we've really only got one place to try to get the sentence at line 10. Because it's a disjunction, add is the likely candidate. Add is one of the ways to derive a disjunction. And according to add, given a sentence on a line by itself, we get a disjunction with that sentence as its left-hand disjunct and any sentence as its right-hand disjunct. And here, that's exactly the pattern that we've got.